Kingdom Hearts. Already, I know half the people who may end up watching this have lost their attention, and it's not hard to blame them. When it was released back in 2002, the world was a different place. Both Disney and Square Enix meant very different things in not only the film industry, but in particular the gaming industry. Certainly from the past, but not quite old enough yet to be considered relics, the world still fondly remembered Disney's classics such as Aladdin, Peter Pan, 101 Dalmatians, or The Nightmare Before Christmas. And back when the name Final Fantasy was as big as Call of Duty and Dark Souls are now, the recent merger of Square and Enix was hot off the success of Final Fantasy X, an immensely popular entry in the series, which had successfully brought RPG fans into the next generation of gaming on the PlayStation 2. When they released Kingdom Hearts, their melding of a Final Fantasy-esque story with some Final Fantasy characters in Disney-themed worlds, it was very well received. So much so, in fact, that eventually, even I, an Xbox fanboy at the time, decided I had to give it a shot. In 2005, when I was 15, I was able to get a greatest hits copy of Kingdom Hearts and play through for the first time. And I loved it. I loved the characters, I loved teaming up with Tarzan, I loved the relatable feeling it gave me playing as a dorky kid taking on the world, and because I played on normal difficulty, I loved mindlessly swinging away with my Keyblade at the evil Heartless, but looking forward to the challenge the boss battles provided. That was 12 years ago. 12 years of growing up, 12 years of maturing, 12 years of new games with great writing, characters, and friendships. 12 years of Disney's explosion into nearly every aspect of pop culture, and 12 years of Square Enix's, ironically, implosion from gaming as a whole. But most importantly, 12 years of Kingdom Hearts spin-offs on nearly every platform out there. I've done my best to keep up with sequels in the series, but even the most diehard fans will tell you that they didn't make it easy. There's been a prequel, there's been a game where Roxas is the main character, there's been a sequel where you play as Sora and Riku, only they're sleeping. There was also that phone game where you were Sora, but you were a digital version of Sora. Nobody's, Xanhort, Time Travel, the Key/X-Blade, which looks like an X but is pronounced like Key, and didn't seem to set off any alarms at Square Enix that it might overlap with Sora's signature weapon in the series. Not to mention how Sora used to be the single and only chosen wielder, and now there are 7, the Unversed, the Keyblade Wars, that goddamn sea salt ice cream everyone eats every day while staring at the sunset, which as much as the writers would like it to be, is not a substitute for character development. What started as a simple story of light versus darkness is now imbued with unnecessary melodrama, overwrought redundant dialogue, and pseudo-philosophy. It had me wondering if, despite my fond memories, the original was the same way, and I just didn't remember how convoluted it all was, because at the end of the day, I got to beat up Captain Hook. Now, as an adult, with retrospect on where the series has gone from here, and more familiarity with combat options more advanced than mashing X to attack, I decided to play through on Proud Mode for the first time, a higher difficulty, to see if it was as wonderful as I remember it being. The original Kingdom Hearts started things off right. Sora, along with his 2 friends Riku and Kairi, because Tidus, Wakka, and Selphie weren't cool enough to be part of your trio, or tag along for the adventure, spend their days running and playing with wooden swords on Destiny Islands, which surely must have been a placeholder name that got accidentally forwarded to the art department and put into the game. Sora spends most of his time trying to impress Kairi, and all Riku can think about is traveling to other worlds. He gets his wish relatively soon, as a storm whisks them all away, destroys their island, and empowers Sora to wield the Keyblade and fight back against the Heartless, which have invaded his world. Soon, he stumbles across Donald and Goofy as they travel across various Disney worlds, teaming up with heroes and fighting their villains while looking for their friends. Eventually, they cross paths with Maleficent, the antagonist of Sleeping Beauty, who is now trying to access Kingdom Hearts, which grants its opener unlimited power. The narrative itself can be awkward and repetitive, especially towards the latter half of the game when you visited all the Disney-themed worlds to take on Ansem, who can't go a single sentence without mentioning hearts. Compared with the trend of troubled and brooding protagonists of the last 5 years or so, Sora is pleasantly optimistic and fun-loving throughout the entirety of his quest, but truly shines when interacting with all my favorite characters from Disney movies. Generally, the best of the game's dialogue is when Sora and the genie are mulling about with Aladdin, or getting a magic lesson from Merlin, rather than when Maleficent is lecturing to you about darkness for the 15th cutscene in a row. That's one thing that stands out about the original Kingdom Hearts. It was still focused on a complete merging of Final Fantasy and Disney to tell its story, rather than with the more recent installments, where the Disney locations are just used as settings to further the Square Enix-influenced epic. And it made the story stronger for it. You get to tag along with Aladdin to the Cave of Wonders and escape on a magic carpet. You get to save Alice from losing her head. You get to compete in the Olympics Coliseum alongside and eventually against Hercules. Not all the worlds are as exciting as the others, or the movies that have inspired them. I'm looking at you, Atlantica and Monstro. But for the most part, they successfully allowed you to take part in your favorite stories, and befriend your favorite characters. The novelty has worn off a bit now that I'm older and have been playing through other titles in the series, but at least they seem to have put some effort into the adaptations, as opposed to Birth by Sleep or Dream Drop Distance, whose storytelling leaned way too heavily on introducing the new villains we'd be facing off against in Kingdom Hearts 3. There are, however, some really nice moments peppered into the late game using the original characters created for the series. The scene where Riku shows up and steals not only your Keyblade but your friends, then tosses you a wooden sword telling you to go play hero with this, is one of my favorite gaming moments, and one of the few sections I feel like in video games at all that successfully make you feel useless. The sentiment carries into the gameplay as well, as Sora can't hurt the Heartless without the Keyblade and has to rely on the Beast to kill enemies. This feeling of being powerless culminates, however, in one of the key lines of dialogue from the whole series, when Sora, staring down Riku with his wooden sword, boldly claims that my friends are my power, and the Keyblade returns to you. It's a great moment of game design, combining the story, telling you that Riku was supposed to be the Keyblade Master the whole time, and that your part in the story is over, while showing the player the impact of this revelation by taking away your ability to function through the most familiar action in the game, bashing the Heartless with a magical sword. Sora's optimism in the face of adversity, as cheesy as it can be sometimes, is an admirable, unfailing part of his character, and perfectly contrasts with the overtly evil antagonists, Disney or otherwise. The merging of two entities to tell a story also reflects in the gameplay as well. Certainly back in the early 2000s, the platforming genre was still fairly popular, with Mario sharing the space with titles like Jak and Daxter, Vex, or Sly Cooper. With Disney elements present, it wouldn't surprise me if platforming sections were sprinkled in to please the younger audience that would inevitably be drawn to it. Because most of the game is running into an area, watching a cutscene, clearing enemies, and moving on to the next, the platforming sections serve as a break between combat and story. While not implemented poorly, they aren't implemented particularly well either, and while most platforms are short enough distance apart so that you don't have to plan out your jumps, there are some that can test your patience. Sora's jumping animation can be a little stiff, and you'll find yourself missing some platforms, which got frustrating in some of the levels that have extended sections, especially if you fall back to the bottom of areas, like in Deep Jungle or Hollow Bastion. Gummy ship segments, in which Sora pilots a spaceship through an obstacle course, found their beginning here, and I won't waste any time talking about them. They weren't enjoyable 15 years ago, and they're certainly not now. Hoping they're left out entirely for Kingdom Hearts 3. The meat of the game, and what you'll spend your time doing when you're not trying to count in your head how many times you think they asked Haley Joel Osment to exclaim, "Riku!" before getting a take they were satisfied with, is fighting Heartless. And thankfully, Kingdom Hearts delivers, with some minor exceptions. I've learned that playing through Kingdom Hearts on higher difficulties changes the game considerably. It's easy enough to skirt through most sections on normal mode by just mashing the X button to attack, occasionally jumping if you want to add some flair. Sora will still be attacked by enemies at the same rate, but you can generally tank a couple of hits, unless you're up against some of the late game bosses. On Proud mode, 2 hits from a regular enemy encounter can leave you in the red, 3 if you're using the defensive spell Arrow to numb attacks. It can occasionally put you on your toes, especially when you're up against enemies with shields or unblockable attacks that can kill in one hit. That said, my patience was certainly tested when I would spend 10 minutes clearing a room and then get killed instantly by one hit and have to start over. Most of the time, this isn't an issue. As a gamer who enjoys a challenge, I like being able to learn from my mistakes and adjust my playstyle, but there are a few instances where checkpoints don't trigger as often as I'd like, setting you back 10 to 15 minutes. Most of the time you can run past enemies if you wish, but that's 10 to 15 minutes worth of experience gained and items acquired, and to reiterate, 10 to 15 minutes of much needed experience and items because of the spikes of difficulty in the late game. One section in particular before the final boss has you enter an arena with powerful, perpetually attacking enemies that took me about 10 tries to beat, with each attempt taking around 10 minutes. I can understand that it's a battle of skill and endurance, but after a certain point, you run out of magic and items, Goofy and Donald are KO'd, and you're still left with respawning enemies who can kill you in 4 hits. Alternatively, if you're not using the arrow spell, it's 3 hits. After a combined hour or so of frustration, I purchased and synthesized all the elixirs I could, which restore your magic and health, summoned Tinkerbell, who hangs around Sora for 5 minutes, constantly healing him, and still I barely made it through. Because for casual combatants like myself who haven't memorized attack patterns, using arrow melts your MP so quickly, which in the grand scheme of things you still need for healing, and there isn't a moment where you're not being attacked by at least 2 enemies, some of which are unblockable and unavoidable. It leads me to believe that encounters like this, and granted they are rare, aren't a matter of being a challenge for players to rise to the occasion, or the Kingdom Hearts equivalent of a Dark Souls boss, but just a design element that didn't translate into the harder difficulties. And don't tell me that necessary grinding in an action RPG is the answer. It's a shame because on this playthrough, after watching speedruns of Kingdom Hearts, where players use some of the special Keyblade attacks which cost MP, but look awesome and do extra damage, I purposely chose a magic-based build for Sora, in hopes that I'd be able to utilize these, opening up the combat options, instead of the previously tried-and-true formula of just hitting X. However, due to the strength of incoming attacks by the time you level up and gain these abilities, bringing with them the potential creativity for more refined combat, with offensive versus defensive MP decisions, they become overshadowed by health management. Donald and Goofy sometimes save the day and throw you a potion, but most of the time, especially during bosses with full-screen attacks, they're usually knocked out in the corner. The first thing you'll want to do after you meet them is turn down the settings for how often they use healing items and magic. Nothing was more infuriating on my proud playthrough than Goofy throwing a Mega Potion to the entire team because a Heartless had scraped Donald's elbow, or watching as Donald casted 4 lightning bolts in a row on an enemy while I, completely empty on magic, was rummaging through my menu for an either while Cerberus tromped at my rear. Overall, the combat works well enough. It wasn't a revelation to gamers back then, and in the age of Bloodborne's precision, Bayonetta's timing, hell, even Kingdom Hearts 2's Flash, it can feel especially weightless. You will get sick of hearing, "Ha! Ha! Take that! See ya!" over and over, because button mashing X does work in most encounters of your playthrough, but thankfully, as the game progresses and you run into more difficult encounters, that strategy will get you killed very quickly. It's a trade-off that has some unfortunate balance issues. On normal mode, you can breeze through the main story, but in the last quarter of the game, you have to play on your toes. On proud mode, most of the time you have to pay attention, but those late-game encounters become more frustrating than challenging, especially taking into consideration how occasionally unforgiving the checkpoint system can be. That said, there's an extreme amount of enemy variety and creativity in their design, which keep the new worlds you travel to feeling fresh, requiring you to adapt your movement in their arenas. The Destiny series could have learned a thing or two here. The first title in the Kingdom Hearts series feels strangely humble when faced with the deep dive the series would eventually take into darkness, handhelds, side stories, and remixes. Its story works well as a charming mix of Disney and Final Fantasy. The combat presented a solid foundation for building upon third-person action RPG combat, and tried-and-true themes of the bonds of friendship are able to shine through some of the muddled and often redundant dialogue. It still holds up. It can feel like a B-movie in an unfortunately non-self-aware way, but there's some genuine moments of chemistry between its characters. The gameplay, platforming sections in particular, which already felt dated when they were released, don't hold up as well, but combat as a whole is fun and challenging when fair. It's perhaps not the flawed but nostalgic epic I remember from my teens, but after replaying, I'd say my fondness for the original is still well-deserved, and one I can now safely and assuredly look forward to replaying in my many years to come.